Hey everyone! Welcome back to my YouTube channel. So today I thought I would do a little video that I'm calling Gemma's Guide to Literary Fiction. What I'm gonna do is recommend different types of books for different types of genre fiction readers. So I have some romance-esque, fantasy-esque, and horror thriller-esque literary fiction novels that I'm going to recommend if you're a genre fiction reader and you want to get more into literary fiction and you don't know where to start. I have a couple of authors that still sort of fit into the genre that you feel the most connected to, but are a little bit more literary fiction-y, just to see if you want to dip your toe in. Then I have some authors that I think are really good starting points if you're getting into literary fiction for the first time. Then I have some just straight up literary fiction recommendations. And then for the advanced literary fiction readers, I have my little stack back here of very strange, weird girl literary fiction. That is my favorite genre. So first, I think I just want to say literary fiction is a very large category of fiction. And it basically just represents any type of novel that prioritizes character, theme, or style of writing over plot devices. So I think with a lot of genre fiction, there's a lot of usage of tropes. One of the main driving forces will be the plot, whereas with a literary fiction book, it's a little bit more ambiguous. It's either trying to tell you something with the style of the writing, trying to illustrate development of a character. That's the main difference between genre fiction, literary fiction. All of it is wonderful, amazing, lovely. I love all sorts of different genre fiction as well as literary fiction. That's just my general personal taste, is that I am a huge literary fiction girl. But through my reading of different types of genre fiction over the past year, I have found pieces of genre fiction that also have elements of literary fiction. I'm going to start with romance. First, I think this is more romancy than literary fiction-y, but I do think that this author has a ton to offer in terms of character development, style, and all of the other aspects of literary fiction. So I have all three of Ashley Poston's adult books here. My favorite is The Dead Romantics. Out of all of her books, it gives literary fiction the most in that it's about grief and one character's journey with grief, despite its sort of cheeky premise about a ghostwriter who can see ghosts. I think there's a lot of depth here, and I absolutely loved this book. Truly, it is just one of my favorite romance novels. It's very unique. I think in all of Ashley Poston's books, you can see that style and character development sort of have a much heavier hand in the text. I think the best example of a romance author whose work reads more like literary fiction than romance is none other than Miss Emily Henry. So if you love romance and you want to try and get into literary fiction a little bit, I would highly, highly recommend starting with Emily Henry and jumping off from there. I've read Book Lovers, Beach Read, and Funny Story. I think Funny Story reads the most like literary fiction. However, all of her books create such beautiful worlds, track the emotional arc of her characters as well as the romantic arc in a way that is so beautiful. I think what's also amazing about Emily Henry's romance books is that the relationships between these characters and their family, friends, whoever the secondary characters are in these books, those relationships are just as fleshed out as the romantic relationships. And I think that's what makes this a really, really good example of walking the line between literary fiction and romance. If you love fantasy and you want to try and get into literary fiction, I think Matt Haig would be a great place to start. All of his work sort of exists in a space between reality and the fantastical realm. The world that he creates so closely mimics our reality, but there's just one thing that's a little bit fantastical about it. So this book in particular, fantastical element is that when you die, you get to sort of relive all of your choices and pick a life to live in where you made one small different choice. And I think that's a great place to start if you love fantasy, is you're still going to get some of that fantasy element. You're still going to get a little bit of world building in terms of how the mechanics of the fantastical elements work. but it is more literary fiction in terms of the fact that it is tracking one character and her emotional arc throughout the story, rather than like a heavy fantasy plot. Similarly, we have Under the Whispering Door by TJ Klune. I just finished this, and this book is similar in the fact that the world sort of does look like ours, but there is a fantastical element to it. This one sort of takes us to this magical, like almost purgatory-like tea shop where dead people can take a bit of a solace and a break before they pass over through the door, as they call it in this book. I would say this is a little bit more fantasy-like than the Midnight Library is, but it's still pretty rooted in our reality. There are a lot of things that look just like our world. I loved this book. It's so excellent, and I think if you're a fantasy reader trying to get into literary fiction, this is also a great place to start. On a different note than these two books, whose worlds sort of look like ours but have one fantastical element, this book, This Is How You Lose the Time War, the world looks nothing like our world and is completely different, but what makes this a great place to start for literary fiction is, one, its structure is very unique, and that is a defining element of literary fiction. The writing style is very experimental. It's also very flowery. The language and the importance of the language and the words chosen are very important in this book. And that is another defining factor of literary fiction. However, if you love a sort of complicated, strange fantasy world, you're going to get that in this too. So that's why I think it's a good place to start for fantasy readers who want to try getting into literary fiction. And finally, if you are a thriller reader, I have a couple of picks for you as well. Don't you worry, I would never forget about you thriller girlies. Thriller/horror, I kind of all grouped together. We have The Vegetarian. This book is about a woman who decides to be a vegetarian, and then it sort of like consumes her mind and she descends into madness a little bit. That's why I think horror fans will like this book, because it contains a lot of graphic, sort of creepy energy and vibes, but it is ultimately about a woman learning more about herself and coming to terms with herself. If you're not a huge gore person, I would say maybe don't start with this one, but don't worry, I'll still have recommendations for you after. And similarly, we have Tender as the Flesh. This is another sort of grotesque, gory, horror type literary fiction about a sort of a satire on the meat processing industry. So these are kind of very similar in theme, but because this book is mainly a satire and a critique of the animal product industry, it has those literary fiction elements where you're following a theme, a motif throughout the novel, as well as getting thoroughly creeped and grossed out. So I think these two are similar. If you love like a gory, creepy horror novel, you're gonna love these two. If you love a bit of a supernatural type horror, I have A Touch of Jen by Beth Morgan for you. Now, this book is interesting because the first half of it, you think you're getting one type of book, and then the second half of it, you get a completely different type of book. This is one of those books you're either gonna love or hate. I loved it because it was so weird. I really can't say much about this other than it's about a couple who stalks this woman named Jen through social media, and one day they accidentally run into her in public. She invites them on a trip, and things devolve from there when they realize she's not exactly who they thought she was. It is a critique of social media culture. The thing, I'm struggling with this because I really can't tell you because it's going to spoil the whole thing, but I will say there are some sort of supernatural, out of this world type elements that happen in this book later in the second half, and you will be shocked. But I think if you're a fan of that type of mystery thriller horror, you will really love this book. It is so weird though, like I really do have to warn you. And if you hate it, don't come from me because I told you were either gonna love it or hate it. And finally, if you are a fan of the classic just thriller, like Frida McFadden-esque vibe, but you want to try and dip your toe into literary fiction, I have two recommendations for you. First, we have The Writing Retreat by Julia Bartz and If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. Everyone knows about this book, everyone loves this book, and it's for good reason. Also, look at how gorgina my copy is. Hello. This book is about a group of Shakespeare theater students at a performing arts college, and they start performing a play and it sort of devolves into madness, and one of them ends up dead. and they sort of have to figure out what happened. And so it's a mystery inherently, but it also uses the intertextuality of the Shakespeare language to drive the plot forward, and you can track interesting motifs with Shakespeare throughout this book. And I think that's what also makes it a really good way to get into literary fiction is you eat this up, like there is a mystery you're following and there's something you're trying to figure out. And I think that's why fans of a mystery thriller novel will love this book, some elements of the literary fiction genre as well. And The Writing Retreat is similar in that there is an atmospheric, creepy vibe the whole time. You don't quite know what's going to happen. There are also a lot of really interesting messages about female friendship in this book, and I think that's also what sets it apart from a typical mystery thriller. Once you've sort of dipped your toe with either your romance, your fantasy, or your mystery thriller horror novel, and you've gotten a little bit of a taste for literary fiction, this is where I would recommend that you start, with this lady right here, Miss Taylor Jenkins Reid. A great place to start with literary fiction would be either one of these two books, Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo or Daisy Jones and the Six. These are two of her most popular books. I'm sure you've heard of them. But what's really cool about these books, they are pure literary fiction. You're tracking characters, development, all of that sort of stuff. There are also really interesting plots in both of these books. So it gives you a little bit of that plot that you're craving from a genre fiction book. They're both also sort of multimedia pieces of writing. So they're both sort of like interview style, like radio show, all of that sort of stuff. And I think that Taylor Jenkins Reid is a great first literary fiction author because it gives you a little taste of what's to come. Now I'm just going to share some of my favorite literary fiction authors with you so that if you are already into literary fiction and you're looking for new recommendations, I have some for you. We have Zadie Smith. I have read these two books, White Teeth and her short story collection, and her newest book is on my TBR, but I love her. I think she's incredible. I think her writing is just amazing, and I cannot recommend her enough, especially these two books. NW is one of the best books that I've ever read. It's amazing. It's a modern classic. Next we have They're Going to Love You by Meg Howry. This book is about a girl who grows up in a family of artists and sort of about her coming to terms with the fact that her parents are people, the fact that she might not be exactly what they expected her to be, all of that sort of stuff. Next, we have Emily Austen. All of her novels are sapphic. They're all queer, and they all talk about anxiety, depression, mental health, and sort of struggling to find oneself and one's place in the world. And I love all three of these books. They're all amazing. Cannot recommend her enough. Next, we have Post-Traumatic. This is another sort of like in your 20s, coming into yourself type novel. It takes place in New York City. It's sort of about dating and friendship and all of that sort of stuff. I loved this book. I read it a couple years ago. It's amazing. This is a true coming-of-age novel. This is old enough about a girl who realizes that she's bisexual in college and how she sort of comes to terms with that and copes with it and tells her family about it and stuff. Next, we have Elena Ferrante, specifically the My Brilliant Friend series. This tracks a pair of female friends literally from their childhood to their death. Almost birth to death, basically. And this is an incredible series. I think it's so rare to have a literary fiction series, and every page of this is just a blessing. Like, this is one of the great feats of modern literature. Look at how lovely they all look together on the bookshelf. Like, hi, stunning. And next we have Sunburn by Chloe Michelle Howarth. This was my favorite book of last year. It was so good. This is about a girl in conservative rural Ireland in the 90s who realizes that she's a lesbian, falls in love with her best friend, and you basically just track that relationship the entire time. It is so good. This is, again, a modern classic, I think. It's incredible. And finally, for my advanced literary fiction girlies who maybe haven't dipped their toe into the weird girl literary fiction subgenre, these are my recommendations for that genre. We have Perfume and Pain. This is a novel about an author who has a sex, drug, and alcohol addiction and follows her descent into madness and then back from that madness and the aftermath of it. It is so good. Another one of my absolute favorite reads from last year. I always say when I recommend this book that it's like if the worst version of me was a character in a book. If that doesn't convince you to read this book, then maybe weird girl literary fiction is not your MO. Next we have Mona Awad. I love her. Bunny is my absolute favorite novel by her. And this is about a group of girls who go to graduate school together and they kill men and turn them into bunnies. And that's what I'm going to tell you about it. And again, if that doesn't interest you, maybe it's not for you. We have All's Well, which is another sort of Shakespearean story about a drama teacher who sort of descends into madness as she's directing a Shakespeare play. And then Rouge has really interesting commentary about the lengths women will go to preserve their beauty as they get older. Except for this one, all three of these have themes of magical realism, and that is my favorite type of novel, one that is just not firmly planted in reality. I love her work, and I'm such a huge fan of hers. Of course, the classic weird girl literary fiction recommendation, My Year of Rest and Relaxation. I am just like every other bitch, and I loved this book. It is the ultimate pandemic novel about a girl who literally never leaves the house and decides for a year that she's just gonna never leave the house and self-medicate, and it's about mental health and self-isolation, and it's quite good. Next we have My Husband by Maud Ventura. This is about a woman who controls every interaction she has with her husband so precisely, and then at a certain point she realizes maybe that has gone too far, and she is also descending into madness a little bit. Similarly with Death Valley, this is about a woman who is attempting to escape the feeling of dread that she feels as she finds out that her father is dying and her husband is really sick. And she sort of gets trapped in the desert and begins to see things in said desert. Another descent into madness. I'm sure you're sensing a theme with all of these books. Big Swiss by Jen Began is about a transcriber for a sex therapist in a small town, and she one day overhears the voice of this woman who she's transcribed her sessions and becomes obsessed with her and eventually attempts to befriend her. So those are all my recommendations for you guys. I hope you enjoyed. I had so much fun putting together this little guide. I'm such a huge fan of all of these books, and I hope that you guys are too if you check them out. Like, comment, subscribe, because I am a YouTuber now. And I will see you guys in the next one. I think I'm going to make a reading vlog next week, so that will be the next video you guys see from me. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and happy reading.